Okay, this is part two of classification and taxonomy. And so we're going to pick back up where we left off. We had begun discussing this taxonomy or the process of classifying things with the discussion about this individual, Carolus Linnaeus, and his system of classification. His idea was that every organism should have a unique scientific name that everybody can use, and each organism just gets one a scientific name, and those names aren't shared, so they're universal in scope. We discussed that the name is a two-part name, hence the term binomial nomenclature. We discussed that, and then the hierarchical nature of Linnaeus's classification system. He didn't have 7 levels. We do. Kingdom, phyla, class, order, family, genus, and species. And the genus and species classifications are actually going to be used for the scientific name of an organism. So we're ready to pick up with our kingdoms. Now, the kingdom level in the Linnaean classification is top level. So if we find any living thing, we have to say which kingdom does it fit in. Within each kingdom, there's just different phyla and classes and orders and families and genus and species. Okay, but we have to determine which of these 6 kingdoms an organism fits into. So this is kind of a nice little diagram here. And this shows you plants or plantae, animalia, fungi, protista or the protists, and then eubacteria and archaebacteria. All right, these are our 5. Not too many years ago, 20 years ago, eubacteria and archaebacteria were grouped together, and there were only 5 kingdoms, and they were called the Monarans. Right, this is an old one. And so we have separated those due to getting more knowledge about how these different organisms are not quite the same. So that brings up a really good point. What does it take to determine that something's in a kingdom? Because these are broad general groups, these kingdoms, you have to have these basic characteristics to define something and determine where it belongs. If we look at this for a plant, all plants are multicellular and they are eukaryotic, right? They have many cells and they have a nucleus. We also have to add on this, and there really should be on here, is that they're autotrophic, right? They make their own food and they do so using photosynthesis and the pigment chlorophyll. Animals are always multicellular and they're always eukaryotic, and they do not have a cell wall. Plants always do have a cell wall. Animals don't have a cell wall. And they have to eat stuff. They're heterotrophic. Fungus are multicellular and eukaryotic. Hey, just like animals. So what's the difference? Well, fungus has a cell wall with chitin in it. And they are heterotrophic. Therefore, they're not like a plant because they eat stuff. Protists are eukaryotic, but from there on out, they can be unicellular, multicellular, heterotrophic, autotrophic. They can have a cell wall. They cannot have a cell wall. Their cell wall can have different things in it. And then we've got our eubacteria, our common bacteria that have peptidoglycan in their cell wall, and our archaebacteria that are unicellular and prokaryotic. So we're going to look at this. This is one way. This is how we look at things to begin with. If we find an organism and we say, what are its basic traits? What do its cells look like? Are they prokaryotic? Are they eukaryotic? Okay. Well, after that, do they have one cell? Or are they multicellular? Okay. If they have a cell, do they have a cell wall? And from there, we'll be able to place an organism in one of these categories. Now, this is not the only way of grouping life. There's an alternate way of grouping life that's become a little more prevalent because it's based solely on DNA. So if we compare the Linnaean system versus the 3-domain system, the 3-domain system uses DNA to group organisms on how similar their DNA is. That's what they look at. So we've talked about DNA. We know that DNA determines your traits by coding for proteins. Those proteins then are expressed, and they cause you to have the cellular machinery to produce traits or to do certain chemical processes in your body. And so by comparing DNA, it's actually a pretty good way of saying if we have similar DNA, we're probably more closely related than something I don't share much DNA with. That makes sense? Here's a diagram of the domain system. And in the domain system, it breaks all living things into three large groups. You've got the bacteria, what we would call the eubacteria. You've got the archaea, which we called archaebacteria. And then it takes all the eukaryotes. And this is plants, animals, fungus, and protists. And it puts them all in a big group called eukaryota, because everything that's eukaryotic, that has a nucleus and has all of those organelles that go with being eukaryotic, like endoplasmic reticulums, all those things, they have shared DNA, or DNA that's similar, because we have similar cellular structures. So they get lumped together in this. Okay, so we can group things by three domains based on DNA, or we can group things in those 6 kingdoms. Both are equally valid. DNA can help support the placement of something in the typical classification system of, plants, animals, fungus, protists, so forth. So each is useful in its own way. Let's take a look real briefly at just some examples of plants here. They are eukaryotic autotrophs. They make their own food. I have many multicellular, but it should say they're all multicellular. I think I should erase that. And they have a cell wall made of cellulose. So these are all different types of plants. Anything from mosses to liverworts to trees. These are all plants, except one of these is not a plant. Can you find which of these pictures is not a plant? It's this one right here. So this is a colonial algae. This is not a plant, right there. And see how it looks rather different from the rest of these. Plants are multicellular. They have a cell wall made of cellulose. This guy up here does not. And I don't know why whoever made this image, they picked the wrong thing. Okay, animals. Animals are eukaryotic heterotrophs. They're multicellular. They never have a cell wall. This picture of animals is a phylogenetic tree. So it shows different phyla, right? Different groups, kingdom, phyla, class, order, family, genus, species. And so these are the branches of the animal tree. And we can see we branch off with, if we're talking about vertebrates up here, things with a literal backbone, we've got fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. However, if we go this other direction, we're looking at the arthropods, which don't have a backbone. They have an external skeleton: spiders, centipedes, insects, crustaceans. Okay, so these are more closely related here. So phylogenetic trees are useful to show relationships. And we can see that, obviously birds, mammals, they're fairly closely related. They have warm blood. They have these internal skeletons. They've got their hearts. They've got certain types of hearts with closed circulatory systems. But then you look down here at like cnidarians, like jellyfish, they're really not that closely related to a lot of things, and they don't look like a lot of things. So that kind of makes sense. So the phylogenetic trees show relationships. So what would be the thing that would be most closely related if we were looking at basic characteristics to a centipede? Well, it would be an insect, right? Okay, let's go on to protists. Now, protists are interesting. They can be unicellular or multicellular. They can be eukaryotic. They're never prokaryotic, because at that point you're a bacteria. But they can be heterotrophic, autotrophic. They may have a cell wall. This one doesn't have a cell wall. An example of a large multicellular protist with a cell wall would be like kelp, like giant seaweed. That is a protist. On the other hand, the parasite that lives in mosquitoes that gets in your blood when they bite you that causes malaria is also a protist. So the kingdom Protista, or the protist, I like to say is the junk drawer of life. If you're not a plant, an animal, or a fungus, yet you're still a eukaryotic organism, you're a protist. There is a huge diversity of protists. Many of them are small, but not all of them are. So they're very unique, kind of an interesting group. There's a ton of different protists. A lot of the things, if you look in pond water and see a lot of microscopic organisms in it, it's likely, if you can see it easily, it's a protist. Okay, final eukaryote is our fungus or fungi. Okay, these are heterotrophs. It's tempting to think of fungus like a plant. They're not. They have to eat. Okay, they can be unicellular like yeasts, but many are multicellular, as we can see all of these different fruiting bodies from all of these different mushrooms. These are obviously multicellular. Now, they do have a cell wall like a plant, and it is made of that material, chitin, which is also found in the shells of some insects, or in insect shells. So that's what makes them tough and kind of make us think they're a little bit like a plant. Okay, finally, bacteria. We've discussed bacteria. We can see some bacilli and some coccibacteria here. We know that bacteria or eubacteria are prokaryotic, and they have peptidoglycan in their cell walls. They have a different material in their cell wall than the archaebacteria, which are also prokaryotic. However, they live in extreme places or have the ability to. Now, archaebacteria and eubacteria used to be grouped together. Why did we separate them? Because I'm looking at these pictures and they look exactly the same, right? Very similar. How could we tell them apart? Well, we couldn't really tell them apart until we were able to look at their DNA. And we said, wow, their DNA, even though they look the same, maybe even live in similar places, all over the place, in fact. But why did we separate them? Well, their DNA looked really different. So we know that DNA controls all of your cellular machinery and traits. And if you have different DNA, you really are different. And so by looking at and comparing DNA between the archaebacteria and eubacteria, as I mentioned earlier, which were grouped together in one kingdom, we broke it apart into two kingdoms. And I think that that's reasonable. So here's an interesting question. What would it take to make a new kingdom? What would it take? Well, we would have to find something that is either a prokaryote or eukaryote, or maybe something that's neither. I don't know how you do that. Probably couldn't, but a prokaryotic or eukaryotic organism. And that organism would have to not have any of the exact characteristics of anything else. Otherwise, we'd probably put it in one of these groups. Interesting thing to think about. Okay. Finally, modern classification. So we talked about Linnaeus. Linnaeus had to only look at the external traits and characteristics of an organism, like how many legs does it have? Does it have fur? Does it have feathers? How is its skeleton structured, right? And those are still valid. However, we also have to take into account this modern idea that we can look at DNA and we can see that DNA, if it's different, they're different. It's the same, they're same. If it's similar, they must be related in some way, shape, or form. And so that tells us a lot. This is tied into modern evolutionary theory because evolutionary theory right at this point is also really tied to DNA, and that's something we'll talk about in the future. Here's another interesting thing to look at called a cladogram. Remember we looked at a phylogenetic tree. Here's a picture of one of those. Here's a cladogram. So this is for dinosaurs showing different clades or divisions of this. So you can see the Ornithischia, which are the bird-hipped dinosaurs, and the Saurischia, which are the reptile-hipped or lizard-hipped dinosaurs. Okay, so you can see how we've got a Tyrannosaurus and where do we got a Velociraptor? Yeah, there we go. There's a raptor. There we go. These guys, they are on the same branch. You can see their hips are shaped the same. That's to us indicates that if we're looking at their skeletons, because we don't really have their DNA, but if we look at their skeletons and so forth, we can see how they are closely related based upon that. Whereas we're going to say that some of these organisms, like this Stegosaurus and this Ankylosaurus, are more closely related based upon their skeletons. Okay, phylogenetic tree this one actually looks at some of your DNA and takes that into account, and it's showing different groups of dogs, okay, or canines, and how closely related they are. So if you look at this is back here. This is where they divide off, and we've got bears and pandas and walruses and so forth. Okay, this is very different, right? These are not very closely related. Now, are they mammals? Yes. Do they have hair and fur and all the things that mammals have? Yes. So there is some relationship there. They're much more closely related than like a a Komodo dragon or something like that, right? If we look right in here we have dogs, gray wolves, and coyotes. So dogs and gray wolves, right? They are very closely related. They're closer on this tree, but dogs and gray wolves are also fairly related to coyotes, right? They can actually interbreed. The most closest related thing on this chart would be a golden jackal. So it'd be interesting to see if you could domesticate the golden jackal like we've done with dogs. Kind of interesting. And then if we look at this whole family, we've got Ethiopian wolves, dholes, and African wild dogs. A dhole is a type of wild dog. All right. But now if we go on this other branch, we have things like foxes. Okay. There's some foxes here and there's some foxes here, like a fennec fox. Again, those ones with the big ears. And then there are the red foxes that we'd find around here. Right. So if you look at this group, these look similar. These guys look similar. These look similar. So this is interesting that as you see similar DNA and structural components to this, you can see how they can be grouped together. So a good question will be, what is the organism that is most closely related to a red fox right here? A red fox, we looked at this, it would be Ruppel's fox. All right, so those are more closely related. Or what's more closely related to a red fox? A kit fox or a raccoon dog? Well, according to this, we share more DNA and we're more closely related to a kit fox if you're a red fox than if you're a raccoon dog. Okay, interesting. So this is something that you might see again, and this just really shows it's like a big giant family tree and show how closely related things are. All right, we'll stop there.